They told us the danger was in the east, that behind the wall, the real monsters waited. But West Berlin had ghosts too, only better dressed. I kept quiet for 40 years. Maybe out of duty, maybe out of fear, or maybe because saying it out loud made it too real. There are files no one should read, tapes no one should replay, and names you don't say unless you're ready to disappear. I carried all 3 in my coat pocket. In 1965, they sent me back to Berlin. Said it was routine, said it was short. They lied. My mission wasn't just to watch the Soviets. It was to find out who, inside our own walls, was cracking the system from within. But once you start pulling threads in that city, you never know what will come undone. Your loyalty, your identity, your goddamn sanity. You wouldn't believe me if I told you how betrayal looks when it wears your face. I stopped trusting mirrors. After that, before I regret saying any of this, hit that like button, subscribe if this is already making you uncomfortable, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from and what time it is. I like knowing where in the world people still dare to listen to secrets like these. They told me to report to the U.S. consulate in West Berlin. No time, no reason, just an address and the word immediately underlined twice. When I arrived, the clerk avoided eye contact and pointed me down a hallway I didn't recognize. It ended at a heavy wooden door with no handle on the outside. They opened it from within. The room had no windows. Just 3 chairs, a metal table, and a single lamp hanging low, like in the kind of movies we used to laugh at until they started, looking more like our life. On the table, a folder with no markings, no seal, just a thin manila sheet folded perfectly square. I sat down. No one came in. Just silence, and that folder waiting like a question no one wanted to ask out loud. I opened it. Inside was a single black and white photo, grainy, but sharp enough to tell it was mine. I took that picture 6 months ago, during a shadow exchange near the Friedrichstraße checkpoint. I knew the angle, the lens distortion, even the damn light leak in the corner. But this photo was never processed, never developed, and definitely never shared, which meant someone had access to my negatives. Someone inside. I froze. Not because of the photo itself, but because of who was in it. A man with his back turned mid-handshake with a figure we later confirmed was Gadru. The man in the overcoat. I never caught his face, but I knew that posture. That gait, that hand. It was Hayes, my superior, clean-cut, always by the book, the man who taught me how to spot a tail. And here he was, tailing our entire operation from the inside. I didn't breathe. I just closed the folder and placed it back exactly where I found it. If this was a test, I wasn't about to fail it by panicking. But then I noticed something else. Under the folder, pressed flat against the metal table, was a thin red line like graphite, but smeared. Someone had drawn an X and wiped it off in a hurry. The door opened behind me. No knock, no footsteps. Just the creak of bad hinges. A man I'd never seen before entered, civilian clothes, pale as paper, and didn't say a word. He looked at the table, looked at me, then said, "Did you recognize the photo?" I said, "No." He nodded, as if that answer had confirmed something deeper than a yes. Before I could ask who he was, he dropped a pen on the table and said, "Write down who you think developed it." I didn't move, just looked at the pen, then at him. "If I was right," I said, "you wouldn't be asking." He smiled. Exactly. That smile told me this wasn't about truth. It was about loyalty. And in Berlin, those two were never the same thing. He picked up the pen and walked out, leaving the door open behind him. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. No one came back. I left the room and found the hallway empty. No clerk, no guards. Just echoes. I looked down the corridor and realized something. Chilling. This hallway didn't exist on the consulate's floor plan. I'd memorized it years ago. This was a sealed wing 1 we weren't supposed to use anymore. One that didn't exist. Officially. Back on the street, the air felt colder than usual. My coat didn't help. I kept my hands in the pockets and walked without thinking. I didn't go home. I didn't call Langley. I walked to the train station and sat on a bench under a flickering light for an hour and a half, thinking, regretting, remembering that photo hadn't just been a warning. It was a message. We see you. We know what you know. And we're watching how you react. And that's when I realized someone had started a second operation. One I wasn't part of. Or maybe I was and just hadn't been told yet. They left. Me waiting. 49 minutes, according to my watch. In intelligence, that's not a delay, that's precision. Just enough time to unsettle a man without breaking him. I stayed in that same windowless room, the folder already gone. No one told me if I was dismissed or being observed. So I waited. I watched the paint peel on the corner of the ceiling. I counted the swings of the overhead lamp. I listened. That's when I noticed the sound. A low murmur coming from the left. Wall faint, muffled, like water behind drywall. At first, I thought it was plumbing. Then I caught a word in German, Beobachtung surveillance, followed by Schachspieler. The chess player. The hairs on my arm stood up. That name wasn't on any official roster. It wasn't on any report. It was the code name we'd used internally between 3 agents only, and one of them was me. The other was my contact in Langley. The third was someone I hadn't seen in months. Thought he'd been reassigned. Or worse, a voice replied in English. American. Calm. Too calm. The tone of someone who wasn't surprised to be speaking in a sealed room with a German officer. He's moving too early. We're not ready. Then laughter. Low, dry. Followed by, he still thinks he's the one playing. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. If they knew I was listening, I was already dead in more ways than one. But it wasn't just the content of the conversation. It was the familiarity. The American voice didn't sound like a stranger. It sounded like someone who had walked those same hallways, drank the same cheap coffee in the consulate's kitchen, and called me partner once. The wall wasn't thick. Berlin's walls rarely were, metaphorically or otherwise. The acoustics betrayed secrets faster than spies did. I pressed my boot lightly against the floor. No echo. The vibration pattern was wrong for a concrete base. That wall was hollow. A shell, built for listening, not separation. I stood and walked once across the room to cover the movement. Then back, sat down slowly, pretending I hadn't heard anything. Inside, my chest burned. The term Schachspieler hadn't been uttered since an aborted mission in Dresden 2 years prior. It was never written, never documented. And yet here it was spoken casually, like old gossip over schnapps. When the door finally opened, I expected to see that pale man again. Instead, a woman stepped in. Civilian dress. Hair tied back too tight, like someone trying to blend in butt. Failing that, she said, "You're dismissed." I said, "Who gave the order?" She smiled. "Orders are a formality now. No explanation. No escort. Just a door swinging shut behind me." I exited the building and walked blindly toward the nearest tram line, heart racing in reverse. I didn't know what was worse, that I had heard something I wasn't supposed to, or that maybe I was supposed to. Back at my flat, I poured bourbon over the only ice I trusted, frozen with my own hands, and stared at the wall. Schachspieler. That name meant something else now, not just a code name, a position, a piece in play. And if they'd spoken it in that room, then it meant the operation was still active. Which meant someone had lied about it being shut down. Someone high. I didn't sleep that night. Just listened to the radiator groan like it knew something too. And that's when I started to wonder, who exactly was I working for? I hadn't seen Richter in months. He was a forger by trade, freelancer by necessity. He didn't pick sides, he printed them. If you needed papers, visas, licenses, or even a French pension record that dated back to 47, he'd find a way to make it look older than time itself. He operated from the back of a flower shop near Tiergarten, behind a wall of dying orchids and permanently fogged glass. When I walked in, he didn't even look up from the magnifying lamp. Just said, "They told me you'd come." I hadn't told anyone. Not Langley, not the consulate, not even my barber. He slid a folder toward me, standard issue, dark green elastic band. On the outside, it said, Fabrications Set B. That wasn't the name of the operation. That wasn't even my designation. But Richter was never sloppy, which meant this was bait, or worse, something prepared for me without my consent. Inside were 2 passports, West German issue, new, unstamped, one with my face and a new name, Emil Kraus. The other had a familiar face, hers, the consulate translator, blonde, sharp, quiet. We'd spoken twice, nothing that lingered. And now we were husband and wife on paper. I stared at the ink, the lamination, the dates that lined up too perfectly. No fingerprints, no record, no instructions. Just one sticky note between the passports. Use if compromised. I closed the folder and looked up at Richter. "Did you make these?" He lit a cigarette and exhaled smoke through his nose. "No." I said nothing. He added, "They were waiting here when I opened this morning. No return address. No message. It didn't make sense. Forged identities aren't handed out like rations, especially not ones that link 2 agents without a shared mission. Unless someone wanted us linked." I took the folder and walked the long way back to my flat. Rain tapped the streets like static. Berlin never stopped humming, wires in the walls, watchers in the shadows. I checked for tails, but the streets were too quiet. That was more worrying than if someone had followed. Back inside, I tore apart the folder. Nothing hidden in the seams. No microdots, no radio dust. Just the weight of it. The implications. Were they prepping me for an extraction? Or a frame job? The next morning, I went back to the consulate. She was at her desk, typing a memo like nothing had changed. I dropped the paperclip on the floor just to buy myself a glance under her desk. No second bag, no exit plan. Her shoes were simple, cheap. Nothing screamed double life. I said her name once. She looked up, confused, or maybe pretending to be. I asked if she'd ever been to Munich. She said never. Her eyes didn't flinch, but her hand froze on the typewriter. Not long, just enough to suggest she was searching through something in her mind, a file she wasn't supposed to have. I left without saying another word. Outside, I pressed my back to the brick wall and stared into nothing. Someone wanted me off the grid or out of the picture, and they were using her to do it. Either she was the bait or she was caught in the same trap. That night, I opened the passports again, touched the laminate, tried to feel like Emil Kraus, but whoever that was, I knew he wouldn't last long. And that's when I realized my real name had stopped protecting me a long time ago. The Adler wasn't on any map, not officially. It was wedged between 2 ruined buildings on Constrays, always half lit, always half empty. The kind of place where shadows sat longer than people. Cigarette smoke clung to the walls like old regrets, and the windows were permanently fogged from inside breath. Not Berlin weather. I chose a table in the back, facing the door. Old habit. The waitress brought coffee without asking. Burnt. Bitter. Perfect. I lit a cigarette and counted the drips from the leaking pipe above the espresso machine. 12 minutes passed. Then she arrived. Same gray coat, same silk scarf she wore at the consulate. She didn't smile, didn't nod, just sat across from me and ordered a cognac without looking up. Her voice was flat, like a metronome with no melody. I asked her why my photo was in a forged passport. She didn't answer. Instead, she slid a handkerchief across the table, pale blue, embroidered corners. Inside was a microfiche the size of my fingernail and a torn piece of paper. Words, "Trust only unsmiling men." I looked at her. Her lips were trembling slightly, but her eyes were calm. Resigned, maybe, or just tired of pretending. She said, "They're watching both of us now." I wanted to ask who they were, but the question would have been useless. If she knew, she wouldn't say. And if she didn't, it meant we were already too far down to climb out. We didn't speak again. She finished her drink, stood up, and left without another word. No code adjustment, no glance back. Like she'd just handed me a grocery list instead. Of an existential time bomb? I paid and left 5 minutes later, pocketed the handkerchief, pretended I hadn't seen the note, walked 3 blocks north before turning sharply east into a side alley, dug into my coat lining for the tiny lens and slotted the microfiche against the STREETLIGHT dot. It showed schematics. 2 rooms. One of them looked like the room I'd been called to at the consulate. The other I didn't recognize until I saw the number. B47. That was the basement archive. A restricted zone even I needed clearance for. I'd been there once, years ago, when the Cold War still felt warm compared to what it was becoming now. Back at my flat, I boiled water and stared at the handkerchief again. Her initials were stitched into the corner. LH. I never knew her first name. Just the translator. Just the woman with the perfect silence. Now I knew she had access to microfilm, drop codes, and unscheduled meets, and apparently a fear of smiling men. I didn't sleep. Berlin's nights weren't built for peace. I sat by the window, watching headlights trace shadows across the wall like Morse code. By morning, I had memorized the schematics, folded them back into the cloth, burned the note. Something inside me changed that night. Not fear, I'd felt that before. This was different. Like I'd crossed an invisible line from observer to participant, from asset to liability. And that's when I realized I wasn't following a mission anymore. The mission was following me. He started showing up near Uhlenstrage, not close enough to alarm, but just within the corner of my eye. Clean suit, slim tie, polished shoes that didn't match the mud of Berlin's sidewalks, Eastern face, Western posture. He never smoked, never made a call, just stood sometimes, with a folded newspaper, sometimes empty-handed, always watching, always unbothered. I assumed at first he was GRU, Russian military intelligence, maybe FSB, though back then the labels blurred. I ran his face through our back channels. Nothing came back. No alias, no file, not even a surveillance note. And that wasn't just odd, it was impossible. In 1965 Berlin, even ghosts left footprints. I tried to lose him once. Ducked through the old tram tunnels under Wittenberg-Platz. Changed coats, switched. Trains took side alleys. Still, he reappeared 2 days later. Across the street from the newspaper kiosk where I picked up dead drops. Except this time, he moved. He crossed toward me. Not quickly, calm, deliberate. His coat was too crisp, like it had been ironed seconds ago. He passed me close enough to touch. I kept walking, Didn't turn, but I felt at his hand brushing my coat pocket. I waited 2 blocks before checking. Inside was a folded slip of paper, handwritten, elegant script. No signature, just 7 words. We play the same game, different sides. I stopped walking. Those were words of threat. They were words of recognition, like a nod from a fellow pawn who saw the same board from the opposite color square. I didn't know whether to be insulted or intrigued. Back at my apartment, I pinned the note to the inside of a drawer, sat for hours just looking at it. No fingerprints, no traceable ink, just a message too subtle for Langley and too poetic for the KGB. Whoever he was, he didn't want me dead. At least, not yet. The next day, I visited an old contact in the French sector, someone who handled non-official covers. She kept dossiers on unlisted players. I described the man in detail: age, build, clothing, accentless silence. She blinked twice, then said, "He's been spotted near Tempelhof. They call him Le Joueur Fantôme, the ghost player." I asked who ran him. She said nothing, just offered me a glass of lukewarm wine and said, "If he touched your pocket, he means you're useful, or he's warning you to get out." I drank the wine. It tasted like rainwater and regret. On the way home, I spotted him again, this time across from the zoo entrance, leaning against a pillar, pretending to check his watch. I didn't stop, just looked once, nodded imperceptibly, and kept walking. He didn't follow, and that's when I knew. He wasn't tracking me anymore. He was circling me. It rang at 3:17 a.m., the red phone, the one we swore never to use unless it was war or worse. I stared at it for 2 full rings before answering. Only 2 people were supposed to have that number. Both of them were dead. Or at least they were last I checked. "Colonel Dubois," the voice said. No introduction, no time zone courtesy. Just a rasp filtered through decades of Gauloises and broken promises. "I'm listening," I said. "Come to the neutral zone. By 5, walk, no vehicle, no security." Then a pause. Then just one more phrase. "Your shadow has a diplomatic passport." Click. I didn't move for a full minute. The sentence didn't make sense, except it made too much. In our world, shadow didn't mean metaphor. It meant handler, or worse, tail. Someone who walked beside you, behind you, within reach of your silence. And if they had a diplomatic passport, that meant they weren't rogue, they were sanctioned. I dressed in silence. No gun, no ID, just the passport Richter had given me. Emil Cross, the ghost. The streets were damp. Fog was dense, thick like cotton soaked in ammonia. Berlin had that smell in winter. Fear in slow decay. At 4:54 a.m., I crossed into the demilitarized strip between sectors. Dubois was waiting. Civilian clothes, thick coat, but unmistakable. He had the posture of someone who'd ordered enough deaths to live with his own. "Your translator," he said, without greeting. "She's not mine. She belongs to someone." He handed me a folder. Standard French issue, brown, heavy. Inside, surveillance shots of her. Not in the consulate. Not in Berlin, Istanbul, Prague, and once in Zurich, holding hands with a man in a NATO uniform I didn't recognize. "This is old," I said. He nodded. "So is the betrayal." I wanted to argue, tell him he was wrong. But then I saw the date on the Zurich photo. It was stamped 3 weeks ago. "She's not what you think," he added, almost kindly. "But neither are you." Before I could speak, he lit a cigarette and looked at the horizon like he was waiting for a train that wouldn't come. "Sometimes," he said, "they don't plant a double. They just let one go." I left without answering. Took the long way back, past shuttered bakeries and silent factories. The fog never lifted. The streets never looked awake. Berlin slept like a patient under anesthesia calm, but full of scars. Back at my apartment, I placed the folder beside the handkerchief she'd given me. 2 artifacts from 2 different truths. Or maybe 2 lies colliding. I tried calling Langley. The line clicked 3 times, then silence. They were listening. Or maybe they'd stopped. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't in the game anymore. Was the board? And that's when I began to wonder, what if I was the real asset under surveillance? The Brits called their archive the barn. No signage, no guards in uniform, just a converted farmhouse outside. Spandau, where the CIS stored files too sensitive, even for their own embassy. You didn't request entry. You were summoned. I got the call from a voice that didn't give a name, only an address and a time. The building smelled of old paper and disinfectant. The clerk was a red-haired woman with nicotine fingers and a stare that said she knew too much. She didn't ask who I was. She simply slid a folder across the counter and said, "You're not supposed to see this." On the tab, giraffe handwritten, underlined twice in blue ink dot inside, 6 pages. Classified top to bottom. Surveillance logs, behavior reports, meeting locations, timestamps. It read like a hunting guide for a ghost. And then I got to the description. Male, American, mid-30s, fluent in German and French. Specialty, counterintelligence. Assigned, West Berlin, late 1963. And then the part that hit harder than anything I'd ever read. Training officer, redacted. Cody name link suspected. I stared at that redacted box. I knew who it was. I didn't need to read it. I trained him. His name was Walker. Agent Walker. I hadn't heard that name in over a year, not since he vanished after a failed extraction. Near checkpoint Bravo, they said he'd been captured. Some said killed. Others said he'd gone mad and disappeared into East Berlin. No. One told me he might have crossed over. The report listed him as an embedded double agent operating within. U.S. counterespionage, the detail that ruined me. Handler likely from internal section. Familiar with psychological protocols. Early rapport confirmed. That meant me. They suspected me of being his backdoor. I closed the file and ran a hand over my face. Everything I'd taught him, dead drops, code phrases, countertails, emotional. Dissociation, it was all in there. Like someone had transcribed my syllabus and used it to build a weapon, aimed at my own side. The clerk lit a cigarette without asking. "He used you, didn't he?" she said. I didn't answer. Just handed the file back and asked, "Where was he last seen?" She flipped the card. 3 nights ago. Outside the consulate. Mine? She nodded. He watched for 11 minutes, then left something in the alley bin. We recovered it. I didn't ask what. She didn't offer. That night, I pulled out an old training photo. Me, Walker, and 2 others. He was smiling in it. That sharp, boyish grin that disarmed rooms and got him through customs without showing. A badge. I thought about that smile. And I thought about the giraffe report, how it described him as exceptionally adaptive, morally fluid. And suddenly, I couldn't remember the sound of his voice anymore. The next morning, I walked past the alley beside the consulate. Someone had scrubbed the wall clean recently. The kind of cleaning that doesn't come from street maintenance. A message had been there, probably a symbol, a code, gone now. Like everything else we once trusted. That's when I started to feel something shift, not in the mission, but in myself. Like maybe this wasn't about stopping Walker. Maybe it was about showing me what I'd built with my own hands. And that's when I realized some monsters don't infiltrate the system. They're born from it. Hayes didn't slip. Not ever. He was the kind of man who polished his belt buckles and folded his socks. Precision dressed as flesh. You could set a watch, to his walk. And yet, that night, he came in 10 minutes late to the debrief, with mud on his cuffs and shoes soaked, like he'd just stepped out of a canal. The room went quiet when he entered. Not out of respect, out of confusion. Hayes looked around, nodded. Once, sat down. His briefcase clicked twice. I watched him. He didn't wipe his shoes. He didn't apologize. That wasn't like him. Kim. The French liaison leaned toward me and whispered, "No rain in Berlin tonight." I knew that. So did Hayes. After the meeting, I waited outside. Watched him exit, slow and stiff. I followed. He walked past the usual checkpoints, took a turn near the abandoned rail yard, and ducked into a supply depot I thought was locked down since '62. I waited 7 minutes, then entered through the rear. He was gone, but his briefcase WASN single quotes T left open almost intentionally. Inside, sealed pouch, red wax, Cyrillic stamps. I didn't need to read Russian to know what it meant. This wasn't ours. And suddenly the wet shoes made sense. He hadn't stepped in a puddle. He'd crossed something. Back at the consulate, I ran the serial number from the internal lock on the briefcase. No match. The registry claimed it didn't exist. Hayes had always carried a standard issue Samsonite. This one was custom. Thin lining. False bottom. I peeled it back and found a single envelope. No markings. Inside, a photo. Grainy, like from a long lens stack out. A figure standing in front of Cafe Adler. It was me. Same coat. Same cigarette angle. Same expression I never liked seeing in the mirror. Someone had tailed me. But the angle, it was from the French sector. Which meant Hayes was either working with them, or against all of us. I went back to my flat and pulled the rug off the floorboards. Retrieved my own stash camera negatives, old ciphers, one tape I hadn't played since '63. I laid it all out like pieces of a broken watch. Somewhere in that mess was a pattern. Something I'd missed. Hayes had warned me once. Back in '61, if you ever see me without my tie straight, you walk away. No questions. That night, his tie had been loose. I hadn't walked away. I hadn't asked questions. And now, I was staring at a photo someone took of me without me ever knowing. There was no safety left. No internal line of trust. If Hayes was compromised, that meant the leak wasn't theoretical anymore. It was operational. And that's when I understood this wasn't espionage. It was housekeeping. And someone had decided I was part of the dirt. It arrived in a plain envelope. No return address. No stamps. Just tucked between my doorframe and the morning newspaper like a neighbor had dropped off leftover cake. Inside, one cassette tape. Black. Unlabeled. Except for a small red X drawn with shaky hands. Almost like whoever marked it didn't want to finish the stroke. I didn't own a tape player. Not anymore. Not since '63, when Langley said audio. Logs were too risky. But I knew where to find one. The old safe house near Savig-Niplitz. The one we used to call the Echo Room, because of the way secrets bounced off the walls there and never came back the same. I waited until dusk. Building was mostly abandoned now, except for an old widow upstairs who thought I was her nephew. I nodded politely on my way in and climbed to the attic level where the reel-to-reel sat like a corpse waiting for its voice. I slid in the tape, hit play. At first silence, then static, then a voice. My voice. I froze. Target approaching. From east, delay sequence. Repeat delay sequence. I knew the cadence, knew the phrasing. It was from a mission 2 years back. Operation Latchkey. But there was a problem. I never said those exact words, or at least, I didn't remember. Saying them. Then another voice answered. One I didn't recognize. Male, flat tone, British inflection. Copy. You're exposed. New orders coming. Another pause, then laughter. Not from either of us. A third voice. And that one chilled me, because it didn't belong on that tape, because it was hers, the translator. The same restrained laugh she gave me at Cafe Adler. When I asked the wrong question, she was there, or someone made it sound like she was. I let the tape run. More phrases, half commands, interruption, interference, then a closing line in my voice again. Tell him I said goodbye, and make it look like an accident. Click. I sat there, staring at the player, waiting for it to rewind itself. But it just hissed. One long exhale of static, like the machine was exhaling truth it never asked to hold. I checked. The tape casing, scratched, rewound. Cheap, not government issue. Someone made this in a hurry. But the voice was clean. No layering, no splicing. It was me, or someone with access to my internal logs. We recorded everything back then. Debriefs, field audio. Most of it stored on locked reels inside. Langley's belly. No one outside should have had it, unless Langley was the source, or unless someone inside was cutting pieces out and building something else. New identity. A new version of me. Back at the flat. I played it again on my handheld. Recorder, this time pausing every few seconds. I was trying to hear what wasn't being said. Background sounds, chair legs scraping, wind on a mic. I needed to know where it was recorded. That's when I heard it. At the 32-second mark. A cough. Short, clipped, like someone trying. Not to be heard. It wasn't mine. And that's when I realized. The real betrayal wasn't that someone forged my voice. It's that someone had been listening to me long, before I ever hit record. The call came from Langley. No encryption, no call sign. Just a raw, unlisted channel, meant only for wartime contingencies or internal purges. I picked up expecting a code phrase. Instead, I got a voice I didn't recognize. Male, no accent. Flat like a machine that had learned to sound almost human. You know who it is, he said. Make it look like an accident. That was it. No name, no rationale, no confirmation protocol. He didn't even say goodbye. I sat there with the receiver still pressed to my ear, listening to nothing. I knew what this was. It wasn't a request. It was a verdict. And I was the executioner. Or the next name on the list, depending on how I played it. There's a kind of silence that only comes when someone decides your morality for you. That call left that silence hanging in my kitchen, longer than it should have. I poured myself a drink, stared at the bottle, and wondered how long I had before someone double-checked my compliance. I already knew who he was. I'd known for weeks. Walker, the same man I'd trained. The same man I saw through a grainy file marked giraffe. I just didn't think they'd make me clean up the mess. I went out walking. Berlin was still wet from the afternoon storm. Puddles reflected too many eyes, and every passing tram sounded like it carried someone watching. I rehearsed it in my mind, how it could be done. Fall from the S-Bahn platform. Stray bullet during a mugging. Bad vodka in the wrong cafe. But every scenario ended the same way, with my face in the mirror, asking myself what part of me they'd kill next. I found him 2 days later. He hadn't changed much, just aged in the eyes, like something behind. Them had stopped sleeping. He was staying in a pension near Friedrichstraße. Nothing fancy, but expensive enough to signal he wasn't hiding. I waited outside for 3 hours, rain creeping down the back of my collar, watching him come and go. Like any other ghost pretending to be flesh. I could have done it then. One shot, no noise, no face, but I didn't, because deep down, I needed to know why he turned. Or maybe I was just buying time. For him or for me, I still don't know. That night, I called the number they used to reach me. No answer. Not even a dial tone. They weren't waiting for confirmation. They were waiting for a cleanup. I sat in my flat, lights off, gun on the table. I stared at it like it was a stranger. Then I picked up the phone again. And this time, I called someone else. Not to warn him. Not to confess. Just to change the game. And that's when I made a decision. If they wanted a ghost, I'd give them one. But it wouldn't be his. The plaza was almost empty that morning. A light wind stirred old leaves across the stone. Berliners passed without looking up, businessmen late for meetings, mothers pulling children along, street musicians pretending the Cold War didn't press down on every note. And there I was, coat collar raised, gloves tight, standing in front of the cathedral like I was waiting for God to come down and explain the mission. I'd arrived early. Always did. Not to check the angles, those I already knew, but because I needed the stillness, a kind of ritual. I lit a cigarette, took exactly 3 drags, then crushed it under my boot. He was supposed to arrive at 10:15. He came at 10:12. Walker. Same coat, new haircut, a single flower in his lapel, like he was headed to a funeral that hadn't been scheduled yet. He walked calmly across the plaza, stopping near the edge of the fountain, turned toward me. No words, just that same damn look he'd given me during training drills. The one that said, "You still don't get it, do you?" I walked toward him, slowly, hands out of my pockets. He didn't move, didn't reach, didn't run. He just looked. Tired. I expected someone else, he said. You got me. I thought you'd at least ask why. I already know why. That was a lie. He smiled, not mocking, almost grateful. Then he nodded once. Just once. So I drew the pistol, silencer screwed on tight. One shot, center mass. He didn't fall dramatically, didn't cry out, just crumpled. Like a man finally relieved to lie down. No one screamed. No one ran. This was Berlin. People didn't get involved. I holstered the weapon under my coat and walked away. Didn't look back. Didn't have to. Somewhere, a radio crackled. Somewhere, someone scribbled a check mark on a file. And somewhere, deep inside me, something went silent. Back at the flat, I threw the gloves in the stove, burned them slow. The gun went into the canal. The coat stayed on. I sat in the kitchen for 3 hours without moving, just listening, waiting for a knock that never came. Later that night, I opened a bottle I'd been saving. Not to celebrate, just to mark time. I played the tape again. My voice, her laughter, his silence. Now all of it made sense. Or maybe none of it did. That's when I noticed it, something I hadn't caught before. At the end of the recording, just before the static, there was a sound. Footsteps. And not just one pair. Two. Maybe more. And that's when I realized someone else had been there that day. Someone who hadn't spoken yet. It came folded inside the morning paper. Same as the cassette. Same as the orders. By now, they didn't need to break into my flat to reach me. They'd mapped my habits down. To the teaspoon. What time I wake up. How I open the curtains. Which sections of the paper I read and which I skip. Surveillance wasn't a threat anymore. It was a routine. Plain white envelope. No stamp, no seal. Just my name typed in block letters. Inside, a single line on crisp paper. Thank you for not saying everything. I stared at it like it might start bleeding. No signature, no heading, no instructions. Just that sentence. Meant not to explain anything, but to remind me of everything I hadn't said. There was something else inside. Another page. A photograph. Color. Slightly faded. Grainy, but not by accident. This was crafted. A street market in Istanbul. Warm light. People carrying baskets. A man buying fruit. Walker got a live. Gray suit, sunglasses, holding a baguette like any tourist playing the businessman. His posture was relaxed, confident. He wasn't hiding. Next to him, arm linked through his, was the translator. No scarf, no fear. She was smiling. Not for the camera, just at him. That was the punch. Not the image, not the survival. The smile, because it was genuine. I expected to feel rage. Or something righteous. Closure, maybe. Instead, I laughed. Quiet, sharp. Just one bitter exhale. I lit a cigarette with the same hand that had pulled the trigger weeks before. Same fingers. Same damn muscles. And I sat down because the room suddenly didn't feel like it had walls anymore. They hadn't needed to eliminate me. They hadn't even needed to lie. They just handed me a mission, counted on my silence, and let the machinery turn. And I did the job. The envelope was a gift, a reward, their way of saying, you're still alive because you did what you were told, but not everything. Because, had I told the full story, exposed the whole thread, they might have burned it all down. Me included. I looked closer at the photo. No visible codes, no timestamp. But I knew it was recent. The air in it had warmth, not the cold tint of archival footage. This was someone's private lens. Meant only for me. And they knew I'd understand the message. They were letting me live. Because I'd played my part, I opened the bottom drawer of the cabinet, pulled out the giraffe file, slid the photo inside, right behind the last surveillance page. I didn't lock it. What would be the point? No report, no follow-up, nothing to file. Who would believe it? Target terminated, but he wasn't. Threat neutralized. But I wasn't. I sat in silence for a long time. Then I poured a drink, not to celebrate, just to anchor myself in the moment. I looked at the letter again. Thank you for not saying everything. They knew I'd figured it out, that I understood what the mission really was, that maybe the people we thought we were protecting didn't exist anymore. Maybe they never did. Outside, the city had changed. Berlin had new flags, new sidewalks, new languages on the signs. But some ghosts don't follow borders. Some just change names. And sometimes, when I hear laughter at a cafe, or see a couple walking too quietly, too neatly, I wonder, is that them? Or is it just a trick of memory? I may never know, and maybe that's the point. If you listen to the whole story, thanks for staying with me until the end. Subscribe if you want to keep hearing the things they never put in the history books. I've finished your full script.